Chapter 10 of Napoleon I, An Intimate Biography, by Walter Geer. This recording is in the public domain. 10. 1799 to 1804. The Consulate. 6 months after the victory of Marengo, on the 3rd of December, 1800, Moreau decisively defeated the Austrians at Hohenlinden, thus opening the road to Vienna. Austria was obliged to sue for peace, and the Treaty of Lunéville, which was in the main a repetition of that of Campo Formio, was signed on the 9th of February, 1801. France was now at peace with all the nations on the continent, and only England kept up the war. She had just compelled the French to evacuate Egypt, and during the 8 years that the two nations had been at war she had conquered many of the colonies of France, as well as of her allies Spain and Holland. But the English people had begun to feel the burden of their enormous war debt, and a change of ministers occurred. William Pitt, the great war leader, resigned, and was succeeded by Addington, who opened negotiations for peace. After a discussion of 5 months, the Peace of Amiens was signed 27th of March, 1802. The terms were very advantageous to France. England recognized the Republic, and restored all of the French colonies and some of the Dutch and Spanish, retaining only Ceylon and Trinidad. She also agreed to evacuate Egypt and Malta. Although nothing was said about the Rhine and Belgium, she virtually recognized the new boundaries of France, which far exceeded those of the ancient monarchy. The peace, which unfortunately was destined to last only a year, was very popular in both countries, and was received with enthusiasm everywhere. In August, the Consulate for 10 years was changed into a Consulate for life, and Bonaparte was given the power to name his successor. Under the Consulate, one of the principal ideas of the Revolution was preserved by Bonaparte, that of equality. Privilege, abolished in 1789, was never to return. All French citizens were equal under the law, paying the same taxes, enjoying equal chances in life. The Bourbons were to return 15 years later, but the Ancien Regime was abolished for ever. Feudal duties were never restored, and every French citizen continued to have an equal opportunity for employment both in the civil and in the military service. But Bonaparte did not believe in the other leading idea of the Revolution, that of liberty. He did not think the French people either desired it or were prepared for it. According to the exposition of his ideas, as set forth by his nephew at a later date, it was the intention of Napoleon finally to "crown the edifice" with the cap of liberty, but he was prevented from so doing by the continual wars waged against him by the despots of Europe, and by his final overthrow at Waterloo. But whatever our views may be as to the correctness of these ideas, the fact remains that under Napoleon there was no liberty of any kind in France. His career was one long denial or negation of it. The activities of Bonaparte as First Consul were unremitting and far-reaching, and the work which he did at that time has remained, while his conquests have passed away. One of his first acts was to make peace with the Church, following the wise advice of the old Abbé de Saint Ruf. He perceived that one of the strongest elements of strength of the monarchy was its close alliance with the Papacy. The mass of the French people during all the stress and storm of the Revolution had still remained faithful to their religion. Immediately on his return from Marengo, Bonaparte made overtures to the Pope, which resulted in the famous treaty or Concordat, which remained in force during the whole 19th century, and was only abolished in 1905 under the Third Republic. In doing this he was not actuated so much by religious feeling as by a shrewd political sentiment. It was one of his wisest acts. The army, which was anti-clerical, was bitter in its opposition, but this did not move Bonaparte from his purpose. He knew the control which the parish priests exercised over their flocks, and he meant to have them on his side. If his nephew and heir had been as wise in his day and generation, his descendants might still be occupying the imperial throne of France. Under the Concordat, the Catholic religion was recognized by the Republic. The bishops were to be appointed by the First Consul, and they in turn were to appoint the priests, with the consent of the government. Their salaries in both cases were to be paid by the state, so in fact they became government officials. The Concordat was very popular with the people, and its effects were far-reaching. The clergy for the most part abandoned royalism, and became firm supporters of the new regime. Although Napoleon afterwards came to consider the Concordat as a mistake, its immediate advantages were undeniable. The chief monument to the memory of Bonaparte, however, is the Code Napoleon. At Saint Helena he said, "My real glory is not having won 40 battles. What will never be effaced, what will endure forever, is my civil code." In this opinion he was not mistaken, for the code has proved more enduring than his conquests. This famous code was an orderly, systematic, compact statement of the laws of France. Before the Revolution, France had been governed by an old and complex system of mediaeval laws of different historical origins. With the Revolution had come a flood of new legislation which had further complicated the situation. Bonaparte now devoted his marvelous energies to bringing order out of this chaos, and in a comparatively brief time, the lawyers and the Council of State, to whom the task had been submitted, had finished their work. The underlying principle of the code was that of civil equality, established by the Revolution. The code was later adopted by Italy, Belgium, and the German states along the Rhine, and is still the fundamental law of France, while its influence is strongly felt in such distant parts of the globe as Java, South Africa, and Louisiana. Bonaparte presided over many of the sessions of the Council of State which framed the code, and his direct share in the work was very considerable. It is stated that he was never inferior to any member of the Council, and that he equalled the ablest of them by the ease with which he seized the point of a question, by the justness of his ideas and the force of his reasoning. He often surprised them by the turn of his phrases and the originality of his expression. He was considered by the lawyers a new Justinian, as he was called by the clergy a new Constantine for having arranged the Concordat. As a matter of fact, he was greater than either of them. Nor did these notable achievements absorb all the energies of this remarkable man. He organized the Bank of France, and he created the Legion of Honor, both of which institutions still exist. He reorganized the system of national education. He built and improved roads, ordered canals cut, and ports dredged. Under his intelligent rule, commerce and industry received a new impetus. At the beginning of the Consulate many of the Royalists had hoped that Bonaparte would play the role of General Monk and restore the exiled dynasty, but he had no idea of assuming this part. When this became apparent many plots were made against his life. On one occasion, shortly after his return from Marengo, he had a very narrow escape from death by an infernal machine. The conspirators knew that the First Consul expected to be present at the Opera on Christmas Eve, to hear a new oratorio by Haydn. They also knew that the route usually taken by his carriage was by the Rue Saint-Nicaise, which is no longer in existence. It was a long narrow street running from the Carrousel to the Rue Saint-Honoré, where it ended near the Rue Richelieu, in which the Opera was then situated. This narrow street was chosen for the attempt. An infernal machine was installed in a one-horse cart, which was placed opposite a house before which the First Consul was to pass, and the time which it would take him to come from the Tuileries was carefully calculated so that the machine would explode at the right moment. Haydn was then the most popular composer, and every one was talking of his new oratorio, The Creation. The ladies of the Tuileries, Josephine, Hortense, and Caroline, wished to be present; but Napoleon was not at all eager to go. Fatigued from a hard day's work, he had fallen asleep on a sofa. With some difficulty he is awakened and persuaded to start. He enters the first carriage with Lannes, Bessières, and the aide de camp of Lebrun. He is followed by an escort of mounted grenadiers. Josephine leaves a few minutes later, having been detained by an insignificant detail of her toilette. She is accompanied by her daughter and sister-in-law, and Colonel Rapp. The three ladies and Rapp descend the stairway of the Pavillon de Flore, and enter their carriage. They traverse the Carrousel, and take the Rue Saint-Nicaise, in which the equipage of the First Consul has already disappeared. Suddenly a terrible detonation is heard. When the explosion occurred Bonaparte was dozing. Lannes and Bessières wished to stop, but the First Consul cried, "À l'Opéra!" A moment later the carriage was at the door, and Bonaparte entered the loge with his usual calm face. The windows of Josephine's carriage had been broken by the explosion, and Hortense slightly cut on the arm by a piece of glass. Rapp descended to go and see if the First Consul had been injured, and the carriage continued its way by another street. When the three ladies entered the box, Bonaparte welcomed them with a smile, and then tranquilly asked for the programme of the oratorio. Soon the news of the attempt spread through the hall. 15 people had been killed, and many more wounded. The First Consul had escaped as by a miracle. The oratorio was interrupted while the audience arose and applauded him frantically. A few minutes later he left the theatre and returned to the Tuileries, where he received the reports of the police and the congratulations of his ministers. The public joy over his escape was universal. The attempt on the life of the First Consul was a double shock to Josephine, as it revived at once the talk about the necessity for the safety of the State of an heir to the First Consul, and this, for Josephine, meant what she feared the most — divorce. The Comte d'Artois, afterwards Charles X, was involved in another plot which was even more serious. His agents were the former Chouan, Georges Cadoudal, and the Republican General Pichegru, the former instructor of Napoleon at Brienne. They were both arrested in Paris; the former was shot, and the latter was found strangled in prison. The First Consul now determined to make an example of the House of Bourbon, which would not soon be forgotten. The young Duc d'Enghien, the last descendant of the great House of Condé, who was living in Germany not far from the Rhine, was arrested and conducted to Vincennes. The night of his arrival, the 20th of March, 1804, he was tried by a military court, found guilty of having borne arms against France, and sentenced to be shot. At an early hour on the following morning he was executed in the courtyard of the Château. There was naturally a howl of indignation from the Royalists everywhere. It was perfectly legitimate for them to attempt the life of the Corsican usurper, but he must not shed a drop of the blue blood of the Bourbons. But the object of Bonaparte was achieved. There were no more Royalist plots against his life. When Bonaparte traversed France on his return from Marengo, he received a perfect ovation at every stage of his journey. At Dijon he was welcomed by a delegation of young girls crowned with flowers. At Sens he passed under a triumphal arch inscribed with the historic words, "Veni Vidi Vici." When he entered Paris the night of the 2nd of July the enthusiasm was indescribable. The next morning an innumerable crowd filled the gardens of the Tuileries. In the evening the whole city was illuminated; every window was lighted up. 20 years later, on the rock of Saint Helena, Napoleon spoke of this as one of the happiest days of his life. He was delighted to be with Josephine again. There was not then any cloud between them, and their life was a model of reciprocal affection. He felt that his wife was his good genius. He said to Bourrienne, "The noise of these acclamations is as sweet to me as the sound of the voice of Josephine." It was the expression of La Bruyère, "L'harmonie la plus douce est le son de voix de la femme qu'on aime." 12 days after his return was celebrated the national fête of the 14th of July, anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. The Consular Guard, which left Milan the 22nd of June, had been ordered to be present on this occasion, and it was exact for the rendezvous. At 10 o'clock in the morning it entered the court of the Tuileries bearing the Austrian flags taken at Marengo. The Guard then proceeded to the Invalides, where an address was made by Lucien Bonaparte, Minister of the Interior. After this there was a grand review on the Champ de Mars, where the flags were formally presented to the consuls. At this moment the crowd went wild with joy, and broke through the lines of the troops with an irresistible flood. Every one cried, "Vive la République! Vive Bonaparte!" On the 21st of September, anniversary of the founding of the Republic, the remains of Turenne were borne to their final resting place under the dome of the Church of the Invalides. Here Carnot, the Minister of War, made an oration, in which he exalted the great general of Louis XIV. In the evening Bonaparte and his wife were present at a gala performance at the Théâtre Français. The same day the First Consul laid the first stone of a monument to be erected in the Place de la Victoire in memory of Desaix and Kléber. This square, before the Revolution, contained a gilded statue of Louis XIV, whose name it bore. After the Second Restoration, the statue of Desaix was removed, and in 1822 replaced by an equestrian statue of the Roi Soleil. After the fête of the 14th of July, Bonaparte and his wife left the Tuileries to go to Malmaison, which Josephine had purchased 2 years before during Napoleon's absence in Egypt. The château is delightfully situated on the left bank of the Seine, very near the village of Reille, about 10 miles from Paris. It was at that time the favorite residence of Bonaparte, and during the summer after his return from Italy he passed several days there every week. At Malmaison the great man showed himself amiable and familiar. He laid aside his dignity and took part in the games and pastimes of the château. During the summer of 1801 and the spring season of 1802, Malmaison continued to be his favorite residence. After that its place was taken by the château of St. Cloud. Of the 6 dwelling places of Napoleon at Paris after he arrived at fame 3 have since disappeared: the villa in the Rue de la Victoire, the Tuileries, and St. Cloud. The 3 that remain are the Luxembourg, where he lived for 3 months as First Consul, the Élysée, where he resided for a few weeks during the 100 Days, and Malmaison, which, after many changes of hands, in 1900 was purchased by a Jewish banker, Daniel Osiris, and presented to the State. It has since been restored and refurnished in the style of the First Empire, and is now a museum of souvenirs of Napoleon and Josephine. Among the young girls of the consular court the most popular was Hortense de Beauharnais, the daughter of Josephine. She was not particularly pretty, but was very attractive with her blonde hair and soft violet eyes. She had been educated at the fashionable school of Madame Campan at St. Germain. Here she had as companions Caroline Bonaparte, the future Queen of Naples, Stéphanie de Beauharnais, the future Grand Duchess of Baden, Eliza Monroe, daughter of the United States Minister to France, who was later President of the American Republic, and many other young ladies of the best Parisian families, including the future wife of Marshal Davout, of Duroc, the favorite aide de camp of the Emperor, and of Marshal Ney, the bravest of the brave. At one time Hortense showed a decided preference for Duroc, but her mother was strongly opposed to a marriage which she considered a mésalliance. Tormented by the phantom of divorce, Josephine had set her heart on the marriage of her daughter to Louis Bonaparte. In this way she thought she could reconcile the Bonapartes and the Beauharnais. She could not have any children by Napoleon, but her grandchild and the nephew of Napoleon might one day occupy the throne of France, which indeed happened. Madame Campan seconded the wishes of Josephine, and used all of her influence with Hortense to persuade her to look with favor on Louis. Finally, at a ball at Malmaison in the autumn of 1801, the marriage was arranged. The civil marriage took place at the Tuileries the 3rd of January, 1802, in the presence of the Bonaparte and Beauharnais families. The following day the religious ceremony was performed in the little hotel in the Rue de la Victoire, where the young couple began their married life. The nuptial benediction was pronounced by Cardinal Caprara, who was then negotiating the Concordat with the French government. At the same time General Murat and Caroline Bonaparte, who had only been united by a civil bond, had their marriage blessed by the Church. Josephine also wished to have the same privilege, but Napoleon absolutely refused, either from reasons of public policy or in order to keep the way open for a divorce if in the future he desired one. The shabbily furnished little villa in the Rue de la Victoire, after being occupied for a short time by Louis and Hortense, was loaned by Napoleon from time to time to some favorite general. It was not finally torn down until 1860. The site is now covered by the houses Nos. 58 and 60, and the courtyard, in which the resplendent officers gathered on the morning of the 18 Brumaire, is now divided between the courts of these 2 houses. The street in those days was almost a country road, bordered by small villas. 2 of these, besides the hotel of Josephine, were to be associated with the name of Napoleon. In one, Mademoiselle Éléonore Desnuelles gave birth, the 13th of December, 1806, to a boy who bore a striking resemblance to the Emperor, and who was named Léon. He lived through 4 governments of France, and died the 15th of April, 1881, under the Third Republic. In another modest dwelling in the same street lived the loving and devoted Madame Valeska, whose son by the Emperor was the gifted soldier, diplomat and writer who was a brilliant figure under the Second Empire. He also bore a striking resemblance to the Emperor. At Paris, on the 10th of October, 1802, was born the first child of Hortense, Napoleon Charles, who was to die at The Hague in his 5th year. Because of his strong family resemblance to Napoleon, and the interest which he always showed in the boy, the calumny was spread at a later date that he was really the child of the Emperor. Bourrienne, who certainly cannot be accused of any great good will towards Napoleon, denies this accusation in the strongest terms. In his Memoirs he says, "I am happy to be able to give the most formal and positive denial to the infamous supposition that Bonaparte ever had for Hortense any other feelings than those of a stepfather for a stepdaughter. Authors without belief have attested without proofs, not only the criminal liaison which they have imagined, but they have even gone so far as to say that Bonaparte was the father of the eldest son of Hortense. It is a lie, an infamous lie." During the Consulate was begun the work of beautifying Paris, which was continued under the Empire and completed under Napoleon III. The abolition during the Revolution of the many religious institutions of old Paris had made possible great works of reconstruction. Up to the end of the Revolution, the magnificent Place Vendôme, so familiar to all visitors to Paris, was connected with the gardens of the Tuileries by the narrow passage des Feuillants. On the north side of those gardens, facing the Manège, was the much frequented terrace, where now stands the Hôtel Continental. The Manège had been built for the equestrian training of Louis XV when a boy, and was converted into a place of meeting for the Assembly, after its removal from Versailles to Paris. This narrow passage was enlarged under the Consulate to the present Rue de Castiglione, which connects the Rue St. Honoré with the fine Rue de Rivoli, which was begun at the same time, but was not cut through to the Place de la Bastille until the reign of Napoleon III. The Place Vendôme, begun under Louis XIV, and first called Place Louis le Grand, was later named for the Duc de Vendôme, the son of Henri IV, by Gabriel d'Estrées, whose hotel once occupied this site. The column was erected under the Empire in imitation of that of Trajan at Rome. On the top was originally placed a statue of the Emperor in a Roman toga, which was removed at the time of the Restoration. A second statue in the familiar hat and greatcoat, which is now in the Invalides, was erected by Louis Philippe. Under the Second Empire, this was in turn replaced by a replica of the first statue. From the Place Vendôme, the handsome Rue de la Paix, originally called Rue Napoleon, was constructed north to the boulevards upon the site of the Jardin of the Convent of the Capucines. The Church of the Madeleine, begun under Louis XV, and unfinished at the time of the Revolution, was ordered completed as a Temple de la Gloire, in honor of the army. But the building, which was not finished until the reign of Louis Philippe, was given back after the Restoration to its original destination. The renovation of the Louvre was ordered, and this museum became the treasure house of painting and sculpture enriched by works of art taken from many Italian cities. Orders were also given for the construction of vast galleries which were to connect the old Louvre with the Pavillon de Marsan, and form a splendid façade on the new Rue de Rivoli. This work, arrested by the downfall of the Empire, and completed by the great man's nephew, is an enduring monument to the memory of the two Napoleons. Other works which combined beauty with utility were the prolongation of the quays along the left bank of the Seine, the construction of 3 new bridges, the improvement of the Jardin des Plantes, and the laying out of many parks and open spaces. At a later date the victories of the Empire were commemorated in the erection of the Arc de Triomphe. Some of these works were not carried out until the time of the Empire, but they represent the designs of the First Consul, and may therefore be mentioned here. On the 15th of August, 1802, a splendid fête was given at Paris to celebrate the proclamation of Bonaparte as First Consul for life. That day, the Festival of the Assumption, was also memorable as being Napoleon's 33rd birthday, and as the anniversary of the Concordat. The First Consul now began to sign his name Napoleon, like monarchs, and little by little to surround himself with regal state. St. Cloud took the place of Malmaison as a residence during the summer season, and at this château and at the Tuileries the pomp of the Ancien Régime was copied. Duroc was appointed governor of the palace, and regular court etiquette was instituted. Republican simplicity in dress gave place to sumptuous uniforms and gorgeous liveries which recalled the days of the monarchy. The First Consul, however, still clung to his simple habits, and generally wore the uniform of a colonel of the Chasseurs de la Garde, which was also his usual costume when emperor. He always retained his early dislike of luxury and display, and court ceremonial was ever irksome to him. He adopted it as a matter of policy rather than from personal inclination. A very interesting account of Napoleon's appearance at this time is given by John Leslie Foster, who visited Paris shortly after the peace of Amiens. He is about 5 feet 7 inches high, delicately and gracefully made; his hair a dark brown, thin and lank; his complexion smooth, pale, and sallow; his eyes gray, but very animated; all his features, particularly his mouth and nose, fine, sharp, defined, and expressive beyond description. The true expression of his countenance is a pleasing melancholy, which, whenever he speaks, relaxes into the most agreeable and gracious smile you can conceive. To this you must add the appearance of deep and intense thought, but above all the predominating expression, a look of calm and tranquil resolution and intrepidity which nothing human could discompose. He has more unaffected dignity than I could conceive in man. He speaks deliberately, but very fluently, with particular emphasis, and in a rather low tone of voice. While he speaks, his features are still more expressive than his words." In the interesting but unreliable Memoirs of Madame de Rémusat, we catch a glimpse of the life of this parvenu court, attempting to imitate the manners of the Ancien Régime. Napoleon's reason for enduring this mummery is frankly given in his statement: "It is fortunate that the French are to be ruled through their vanity." "There are abundant reasons for thinking," says Rose, "that Napoleon valued the peace of Amiens as a necessary preliminary to the restoration of the French colonial empire." He had never really relinquished his designs on Egypt, and still set a high value on the valley of the Nile and the Isthmus of Suez. Even at Saint Helena, he said emphatically, "Egypt is the most important country in the world." The French possessions beyond the seas had never shrunk to a smaller area than during the last year of the war with England. It was therefore a source of great satisfaction to Napoleon to recover possession of the large and fertile island of St. Domingue, or Haiti, which in the early years of the last century loomed far more important than at the present day. Under the monarchy, the trade of the French portion of this island represented more than half of the ocean commerce of France. During the Revolution there had been a terrible servile revolt under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, a man of great sagacity and force of character, who had conquered and ruled the entire island. As soon as peace was signed, Napoleon sent his brother in law, General Leclerc, to govern the island as captain general. The expeditionary force consisted of over 60 battle ships with 20,000 troops on board. The forces of the black dictator were overwhelmed, and he himself was sent to die as a prisoner in France. Many of the French soldiers, including General Leclerc himself, succumbed to the unhealthy climate. The history of the former extensive French possessions in North America could hardly be recalled by ardent patriots without a pang of remorse. At the beginning of the 7 Years' War, France was master of Canada and Louisiana, which were connected by a line of interior military posts, while the English were confined to a strip of territory along the Atlantic coast. The Pompadour, who was the virtual ruler of France, joined the alliance of Austria and Russia against Prussia and England. The mistress of Louis XV could not be persuaded to send succor to the brave Montcalm, and the capture of Quebec by Wolfe's army in 1759 virtually marked the end of French control on the American continent, although Canada was not formally ceded to England until the Peace of Paris in 1763, at the conclusion of the war. The same year Louisiana was transferred by England to Spain, in return for other concessions made by the court of Madrid. Many efforts were made by France to regain her former Mississippi province, but all in vain, until July, 1800, when Spain agreed to transfer Louisiana to France in return for the cession of Tuscany to the heir of the Duke of Parma. This young man had married the daughter of Charles IV of Spain, and for his benefit the contemptible king was ready, nay eager, to barter away the half of a continent. On one pretext or another, however, the actual transfer was delayed over a period of 2 years. The opposition of the United States to having the mouth of their greatest river in foreign hands was very strong, and President Jefferson sent Monroe to Paris to purchase the French claims. For many reasons Napoleon was willing to agree to the bargain, and for the paltry sum of 60,000,000 francs, the United States gained a peaceful title to Louisiana and the vast tracts west of the Mississippi. but it proved after all an excellent bargain for France, as it prevented the territory from falling into the hands of England when hostilities began again within a few months. An attempt at this time to revivify French influences in India was also thwarted by the breaking of the peace. In no other way was Napoleon's statesmanship revealed more clearly than in his whole attitude towards European and colonial politics, which were so strongly to affect the fortunes of the nations during the latter part of the 19th century. His grand schemes failed because of the relentless hostility of England, and not because, as stated by Rose, they were too vast fitly to consort with an ambitious European policy; when, in the words of Talleyrand, he, Napoleon, began to sow the seeds of new wars which, after overwhelming Europe and France, were to lead him to his ruin. It was the English aristocracy which, in its determination to crush Napoleon, formed coalition after coalition against him because he was justly regarded as the foe of special privilege. For the accomplishment of this end, during a period of nearly a quarter of a century, Europe was deluged in blood; and then after his fall, English writers endeavored to prove that Napoleon was a tyrant who threatened the liberties of the world. Even a historian as generally fair as Rose is not able to entirely overcome this old insular prejudice. As has already been stated, the peace between France and England was not of long duration. The agreement to evacuate Malta had not been carried out by the English government, whose apprehension had been aroused by the colonial projects of the First Consul. In fact, the peace between the two nations was little more than a truce. After much diplomatic discussion, Great Britain broke off negotiations on the question of Malta, and withdrew her ambassador from Paris the 12th of May, 1803. In 5 years, the situation of France with regard to England had materially changed. In 1798, Bonaparte had advised the Directory against an attempt to cross the Channel. Now the resources of France were vastly increased, and in 1803 he decided to undertake the invasion of England. He began preparations with his usual thoroughness. Every port on the Channel was improved and fortified. From Antwerp to Dieppe, camps were formed in which troops began to assemble. Hundreds of gunboats and light cruisers were collected. But it was as useless now as 5 years before to attempt a crossing while the British fleet held command of the seas. Napoleon therefore planned a gigantic naval campaign to give him control of the Channel. There were 2 principal French fleets, one of which was at Brest, where it was closely blockaded by Lord Cornwallis, while the other was at Toulon, watched by Lord Nelson. Under instructions from Napoleon, in the spring of 1805, the Toulon fleet stole out, sailed through the Strait of Gibraltar, and made for the West Indies, with Nelson in hot pursuit. It then turned back, and again evading Nelson, sailed for Ferrol, a port in the northwestern part of Spain, where it was to free a small squadron which blockaded there, and then proceed to Brest. So far, Napoleon's scheme had worked perfectly, and he hoped with the combined fleets to overpower Cornwallis and control the Channel. But his plans were ruined by the incompetency of the French Admiral Villeneuve, who, after an indecisive action with an inferior English fleet off Ferrol, on the 22nd of July, sailed for Cadiz instead of Brest. Napoleon was furious, and threatened to remove Villeneuve. In order to forestall this action, on the 21st of October, the French admiral came out of Cadiz and met the English off Cape Trafalgar. The Franco-Spanish fleet was defeated, and almost entirely destroyed by the superior skill of Nelson, but the greatest of English admirals paid for the victory with his life. In the meantime, however, other events had put a stop to Napoleon's plan for an invasion of England, and the campaign of Austerlitz had begun. End of Chapter 10.